Ba-da, ba-da, mana, mana. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. I'm Pastor Megan. I'm at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, and my caffeine hasn't kicked in yet, but I bet some point during this Bible study it will, and you'll notice when, and sorry. We have worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. You can check us out online at gracesf.com, and yeah. We do a lot of online videos and Twitters in betweens. Sorry. Go ahead, Amanda.
We're good. Good morning, everyone. This is Pastor Amanda Zentz. I serve at Central Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon. Right now, I am sitting here with my Annabelle. She's joining us this morning. And you might see my black dog come around or hear her if she decides that there's someone somewhere on the earth that needs to be warned that there is something happening that they should know about. Like I said, serve at Central Lutheran in downtown Portland, Oregon. Our worship services are at 10:15 each Sunday morning. You are totally welcome to come check it out. And you can find more information about Central at www.centralportland.org. And cheers to caffeine.
Yay.
Yay.
Sorry, we took a couple weeks off. We did so because we were actually in the same place at the same time, which is funny. We didn't have Bible study because we were in the same place. We had a bunch of meetings, and the outcome of those meetings will be that we will get to have some really cool Bible studies that do not suck. We are working on planning some activities around the Reformation 500th anniversary. So starting October of 2016, I know it's a whole year away. We're that far ahead. We will be doing some intentional Luther readings and learning about the Reformation as in addition to some of our Bible study stuff. It's going to be really cool. And that's why we were working while we were not working.
That's right. It happened. And just to let you know that we also heard some reports from the National Church Council about some upcoming reports and studies and statements that are going to be really fascinating, and a message that's hopefully going to be coming out from the Church Council on gender violence. And there is
really good.
Megan says it's top notch. There's also a social statement that is currently in the works that will be voted on in 2019 that we sat in on a workshop on about women and justice issues. And so if you're curious about the ELCA's social statements and you would like to know more about what they are and what as a denomination, we have gone through a many year process to agree upon as our stand upon issues such as abortion, GMOs, drugs,
other stuff that sucks.
Right? We actually have the ELCA social statements where people have done a lot of work over many years to find a cohesive ability to speak to these topics theologically from our voice. And so if you're curious about those things, I find them very helpful and very interesting. And I really like that my denomination takes the time to take on these hard topics and find a way to bring a multitude of voices together to put forth a platform that gives some guidance and thought. You do not have to agree with it. If you are a member of the ELCA, you don't actually have to agree with it. It is simply something that the majority of the denomination, considering we're pretty big, that we have come to agree upon and kind of take as a base for official things like policies and actions by bishops and lobbying, the work that we do for policy reform at local state governments as well as at the federal level government. So if you'd like more information about that, I'm sure Pastor Megan is going to put a link to our social statements down below and you can take a look at those.
Yeah, they're at elca.org. And ELCA stands for Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is just like the progressive Lutherans. That's the nice way I'll say it. Yep.
So let's talk about our scriptures for this week.
Let's talk about scriptures. Before we do that, I want to give let's talk about justice for a second, because almost all of the scriptures are going to talk about justice as we go along. And I thought it might be helpful to talk about the different kinds of justice that ethicists think about. Ethicists.
It's like Ephesus.
Yeah, so there's and I'll put a link to these descriptions, right? So there's 4 main types of justice that people talk about. The first is distributive justice, and that means money, basically. It's about getting fair pay and fair wages, and that you get fairly compensated for things that happen in your life. There's procedural justice, and that's the idea that that there is an imbalance in the world, right? That a way to solve this imbalance in the world is to try to correct it, and that there are different institutions that try to correct it. So, for example, our taxes are different percentages for different people based on how much money they make. We have different fines for people who have their first ticket than for people who have their 5th ticket. There's different ways that you're received into the church when it's your first time becoming the member of a church, i.e. you get baptized, than if you've been a member of a church 1,000,000 times. So there are just different ways that we try to make the world more fair by changing the ways that like institutions work. Then there's restorative justice, and that's the idea that when something is broken, you fix it. The difficulty is that, like, if a pot breaks, you might be able to glue it back together. In Japanese tradition, they would put it back together with gold, and they would decide that because it had broken, it was much more beautiful than before it had ever been broken, and it makes it much more valuable. So you can restore a pot, but you can't restore a lost child. Or if a police officer kills someone, there's not a way to make that person resurrected in our way of the world working. We have spiritual ways that we think about that happen, but not like ways you can really correct that. So then we try to think of ways that we can restore ourselves to each other that really kind of is unjust, right? If there was a penalty and the police department gets sued and they have to pay $40 million because they shot someone, the parents might be grateful for the $40 million, but also like they would rather have their kid, and they would trade their lost child for that money any day. Like they'd way rather. That's not really true restorative. And it's very hard to find actual restorative justice in the world. Desmond Tutu has some processes that they've used about it, and you can read, I'll put a link down here to Desmond Tutu's book on justice, and you can learn more about restorative justice if you're interested. During the apartheid in Africa, they tried to do this a lot, and it's up to you to decide if it was successful or just. Then there's retributive justice, and that's retributive justice is the justice that you might have heard angry Christians talk about. It's we've been bad, so this tornado is God's way of punishing us. It's also if you have to have a timeout from your parent, or if you get, I don't know, 40 lashes in a place, that would be this kind of justice. And the idea is that punishing you convinces you never to do bad things again, either because you're so afraid of what the punishment is, or because it still stings, literally, because you got like beat up. So those are the kind of 4 ethical types of justice. And some people like different kinds of justice better than others. And some people will say, oh yeah, that one's the one that God does. And the truth is that you can find all of those 4 types of justice throughout the scriptures, because God has different ways of doing things at different points in the story, and different people writing the story needed or wanted different types of justice. There are times when everyone's killed with volcano sulfur, right? There are times, and that's, do you know what kind that is? Oh, very good. You're right. See how I did that? I hope you were right. I couldn't hear what you were saying, though, but shout a little louder. Oh, yeah. No, you're right. Okay, yeah.
We're working on being a little bit more like
Omnipresent.
interactive with
Ooh.
our viewers. Is that
Yeah.
what that was?
I don't know. I just think it's fun. I've been thinking a lot about Peter Pan and how Tinkerbell comes back to life on the TV. You don't know if I've never clapped from home, but Tinkerbell always comes back to life. So I believe that other people clap, I guess. So, so that was my Tinkerbell moment. So the Job reading, that is the first of the readings for this week, is about this conversation. What kind of justice does God have? And all of Job's friends assume that Job has been bad, and that's why every bad thing imaginable happens to Job. So they assume that the world operates through retributive justice, right? They assume that if Job's family is dying, then that means that Job has done bad things. And God never answers the question about what the heck is going on. The book begins with kind of a dare. Satan at the time was someone whose job it was to go down and see if people were as faithful when God wasn't looking, right? Because God didn't have texting or video cameras or, Superman beams where God could just know everything that was happening in the world. Their idea was that God sat up in the heavens and God could see what was going on when God came down and interacted with people. But when God went back up to their throne, God either wasn't paying attention or didn't have the time, or couldn't see that far. And so Satan would go down and different angels and messengers would go down and they would do this relay to provide information back and forth. And so Satan's job was to say, I think this person doesn't really follow you all the way, and the way I can prove it is if this thing happens to them. And so Satan convinces God at the beginning of the book of Job to take away all of Job's stuff. And Job, instead of being grumpy about it, instead of being like Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah's mad at God a lot and is like, you promised us justice, where's my justice? Job kind of just keeps taking it. Every time something bad happens to Job goes, well, God's bigger than me. And then something really else horrible happens, like all his wives are killed. Well, if God did it, it must be okay, right? Job never has a moment where he's like, enough already. This sucks. How can you possibly, like, God? And that, for some people, that's amazing. That's exactly how we should be. Every time something bad happens to us, we should never question it. We should never demand justice because God is bigger than us.
And the stuff that happens to Job is really quite substantial. Like,
it's horrible.
He loses, so his entire family is killed. Wives, children, everybody's killed. He loses
it starts with like STDs and acne.
Right. It starts
like boils
with
on his face.
Ugh. Like with physical issues and physical problems, and then it escalates to eventually where his entire family is gone, his entire property is gone, everything is gone. He's just sitting in this circle in massive amounts of physical pain, horrifying, excruciating emotional pain, sitting in the middle of the ground. And his friends are like giving all sorts of crappy advice or honest advice.
They're just kind of mean. They're like laying it on him, like, you must deserve it because look what's happening.
Yeah,
We've all been there.
If in these days where, like, when you have had your dark moments in your life and things have just not been going your way and you just take hit after hit after hit, that was maybe like a tenth of what Job experienced, right? Like, it's extreme and it's crazy how much this guy goes through. So then Megan, I pass it back to you for today's reading.
Okay, so then we get to the point today where Job is like, can you give me an answer about why this is happening? Finally, Job says, this isn't fair. Can you tell me why this is happening? And that's what Job says right before these couple of verses. It's not fair. Tell me why you're doing this. And instead of answering, instead of admitting that Job is not guilty, which it's clear throughout the whole book that Job is not guilty, he's just being punished for what seems like a game. So instead of saying, you're right, you're not guilty, God says, I am God and you are not. Do you understand how the cosmos was made? Do you understand how to do all this hard stuff? Do you understand how I made you? Do you understand kind of the mysteries of the world? It's like God is Stephen Hawking's and understands like quirks and quantum physics, and Job is just like, well, I guess you're right. And the interesting thing is that God does not seem upset by the weird I always say this word wrong, the retributive justice that's happening. God's not like, oh, sorry, my bad, I was a jerk, I shouldn't have played this game on you. And so some people on Twitter call the book of Job the time Job put God on trial and won, right? Because it's really clear that it's not fair what's happening. And it leads to this idea that God's not fair, that God doesn't act fairly. Whatever style of justice God is using, it's not fair, but God's bigger than us and God is God. And so it kind of said it doesn't matter that it's not fair because it's God. And when God does it, then it's right. And I say that with that kind of lilt because it's like a God is right, question mark, exclamation point, question mark. Like we're not sure. And we don't want to say anything bad about God because look what happened to Job.
But we don't totally agree either. I mean, this is one of those books that's and what's interesting about how uncomfortable this book makes us is that at the end of the book, Job gets everything back. Like he gets new wives, new home, new everything, right? But I mean, the widows and widowers that I know who remarry, they still miss their first spouse, right? And so it's not like the experience goes away because he's rebuilt a life or being given a second chance or a new version of his old life. But actually, scholars think that ending was added to the book, that was not actually the ending of the book, that is, what the original intention was. So kind of like the Gospel of Mark, where we don't like the ending of it because it leaves us at the empty tomb and the women running away scared. We don't, and so writers later added on a little bit to the Book of Mark. We don't really like the way the Book of Job ends because it doesn't feel kind of like the God that we want to worship would do something this crappy. And so we've added on kind of this, he gets everything back at the end sort of feeling. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you had said that when I was having to take my phone call, but
nope.
So, I mean, the book is a really tough book to kind of sit with and to walk with. And yet I think it also resonates with people because we know what it's like to be in those situations where it's like, okay, really? Like, this is unjust. This isn't fair. I don't want this thing to be happening. Yeah. Interesting stuff, that Book of Job.
Yeah, and depending upon your standpoint, depending upon the culture that you were raised in or the culture of the church that you believe in, you can read the Book of Job in completely different ways. Same book, same translation, you can read it in completely different ways. And so some people will say, the Book of Job proves that we should just endure whatever God gives us and still be thankful at the end. And other people will say, the Book of Job proves that God's not fair and this world is a mystery. And other people will read, the book of Job proves that God wants us to say when, right? God wants us to say enough is enough already, and then God stops, right? Because bad things stop happening to Job when Job finally says enough already. And he just takes a really long time to do it. He waits until he's like sitting naked in a hole with nothing else, right? Last week we had a story of a ruler who was told to sell all of his things, and some people believe that he then gets, well, let me see if I got one of these over here. Some people believe that he doesn't sell all of his things and move on, but some people believe that he does. And then, I can't find it, but I'll put a picture of it down here. So in our congregation here at Grace, we've painted a picture of the naked guy from the Gospel of Mark, under the assuming the best about the rich young ruler, that he did go and sell all of his things. And there's a story later in the Gospel of Mark about a guy who's only wearing like a bed sheet wrapped around him because and then when they come to like get Jesus, all the soldiers, they grab the sheet, and it's like a joke in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. They grab the sheet and he runs away naked. And so he's left with nothing. And then there's another third instance, because I think things in the Gospel of Mark happen in threes, where there is a man who says, Jesus is not here. He has resurrected. He's gone ahead of you. And it's a dude in a sheet again. And it's possible that this is the rich young ruler who sold all of his stuff, and so he's just hanging out with just his sheet, and he's vulnerable in the world, because there are lots of stories throughout our sacred scripture about people being vulnerable and needing to be dependent upon God being the most faithful. Not because not being a good steward of your money is what God is wanting, because in fact, there's someone who has written that 10% of the ideas about what you should do that is talked about in the New Testament is actually about money, about good stewardship, about investment, or about giving money to the poor. So the Bible cares very deeply about being a good resource and a good, I don't know, like a responsible person with your money. But there is this idea that the more vulnerable you are, the more you need God. And so that's part of what Job is up to when he's sitting there naked in his hole. I don't know if he's naked, but he's sitting in his hole and he's lost everything. And it's this story of vulnerability, that he's entirely dependent upon God at that point. And I don't know, there is some truth in it. I don't want anyone to suffer. I don't want anyone to get the idea that they should cause suffering on themselves or they should do self-harm in order to gain enlightenment. But we do learn some lessons when bad things happen to us. That doesn't mean we want bad things to happen to us. I think the best thing we could do is to learn to become a society that can learn those lessons without the suffering. But many of our deepest lessons come from that, like cartoon characters where the Roadrunner has to get the coyote, but it never stops him. He always starts over again.
It keeps going over and over and over. I think I like when we talk about those things, we just, the one piece of advice that I would give, it's kind of like, don't tell someone to forgive when they're still in the middle of the pain of something.
Yeah.
When someone is in the middle of the pain of a great loss or a great trial, telling them there's something you're going to learn from this, and you can use this for God's good purpose.
This
like
is all
it's
for
well
the best.
intended. It's well intended what you're saying, but it's kind of like when someone that you love and adore has just died from cancer, and someone looks at you and says, "God needed another angel in the sky." Bullshit. God didn't need another angel in the sky. You needed your father, mother, brother, sister, husband, wife, person with you, and God doesn't need them anymore. It's just how we comfort our awkward self as we sit next to someone whose grief is larger than we know how to sit with. We say stupid, dumb things.
Exactly.
And yeah, I'm going to make sure my dog isn't saying hello to people. Hold on.
So that's part of what happens then when our different theologies mash up with each other. So if your theology is bad things happen to people who deserve it, like if you believe in retributive justice, or you believe in, and someone else believes in restorative justice, and you're like, that can be how it feels when well-meaning, lovely people say dumb things to us. And speaking of well-meaning people who say dumb things, Book of Hebrews is one of those books of the Bible that takes the stance that when suffering happens, it's good for you. That Jesus becomes a perfect person by suffering a lot. And I don't know, I think it's kind of a weird a weird, bizarre idea, but in a lot of the words that people use about what Jesus is going through, they're trying to make the argument that all the ancient ideas of what the Messiah was supposed to be the person who ends all wars, the person who ends all hunger, the person who brings complete justice in all of the forms to the world. And when Jesus dies on a cross, you have to figure out what that means and how that can still be the Messiah, and how justice can be done through this horribly violent crucifixion. And so the book of Hebrews is one place where they try to make that argument. Oh, no. It's not through feeding all the hungry that the Messiah comes. It's through suffering, because suffering makes us better, life on the cross. And so sometimes, because we are people who live on this side of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the cross is a symbol that we talk about, we and Christians everywhere err on the side of suffering is great, because our biggest example is one of suffering on a cross. And every year we revisit that suffering. And I like to not dwell in that road, in part because I've worked with the homeless and hungry for so long, and I see that there's enough suffering in the world, and that population doesn't need to be told that suffering makes you better, because they're not living in the lap of luxury. They're very close and vulnerable. And so I like to think of the cross as having a no occupancy sign, right? If Jesus conquered all suffering, then that's checked off the list, right? It's like if you've ever played any of those geeky video games where you have to like do enough farming to feed your troops, and you have to have learned enough research to like know how to kill the particular monster, and you have to go and gather enough things. Hi Tristan, we love you. If you've ever played any of those types of games,
things because you have new gamer headphones, and so you're thinking about cool gamer people who spend time doing these things.
Or I love your husband because he's great. But if you've ever played any of those games, you know that once you've done something, you get to check it on the list, and then you go on a different quest. You don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over again. If you've got enough wheat, then you have to go and get the next treasure chest piece that you need to blah, 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 blah. I don't understand it entirely. I'm just trying to love people. Right?
You're
but this
close.
is what I think about. This is what I think about Jesus on the cross, is Jesus fulfilled the suffering quest, right? The journey through life, death, and resurrection has been checked off the list. Any sort of need for sacrifice, checked off the list. Any sort of like payment for bad crap we've done in the world, checked off the list. That quest has been done. And then our job, God's work, our hands, is to like go gather more wheat to feed the people who are hungry, to go research not sucking, and to like do all of these other tasks, that we are freed from our need to keep on suffering, because it's already, suffering has been done to perfection. And so I choose to retranslate this idea, not that Jesus was perfected in suffering, but in my head that suffering has been perfected. It's crossed off the list. We don't need to do it anymore, or invest our time and energy in things that will hurt us or cause suffering for other people, because check, it's like ultimately checked off the to-do list forever. Yay, let's enjoy amazing non-suffering world. I don't know how to get us there, but that's what I think it should say.
Amen.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say, and because I've been researching saints, I'll put another picture down here, is Priscilla and Aquila from the Acts of the Apostles are a like couple of awesomeness in the faith. And Priscilla was a teacher who is credited by some to be the author of the book of Hebrews, which I think is pretty kick-ass, because I did not know until I researched the two of them earlier this year that any of the books of the Bible were even imagined to be written by women or a woman. And that's pretty cool. I can't say it happened for sure, but I think it's a good story, and I'm going to go with that story.
And it's fun to suppose what would that mean, and what would that look like, and then what role would that have meant that they held. Or
And
that
what would it
person
mean for
held
the
in the
early
early
Christians?
church.
Yeah, what would it have meant for the early Christians that a role that typically was not for women to do, writing, right, was something they allowed women to do? Ooh.
And the early
Upsetting
Christian church
things.
was a really fascinating thing like that.
Yeah.
And
Amanda
hopefully
knows a lot about the early Christian church.
in the next year or two, I'll have more to be saying about all of those things as I continue my research.
Really Gospel of Mark is my favorite. This text is hysterical. Hysterical. Let's take a moment and think about this text because so it starts with, so Jesus has told them that his job is to be a servant for the world, not to be the king, not to be bloody conqueror, despite what others might say on Christ the King Sunday, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That in the Gospel of Mark, at least, Jesus is like, I am a servant. I'm going to wash feet. I'm going to heal people. I'm going to be the king of the prostitutes. What? I am going to be the king of all the people who everyone says they're horrible. I'm going to be their person. And so James and John, they are the ones who abandon their dad in a boat.
Poor Zebedee.
Oh, Zebedee. And so so they come back and they're like, so you're going to be a servant to everyone, huh? That means you have to do whatever we say. No, really, they said that. They said to Jesus, you have to do whatever we say, which you can find in the scripture, this idea that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. It's in there. It says God has to do whatever we say.
If you ask something of God, that God will do it, that is in there.
That's
And 35, the translation that we have here is actually, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.
Yeah, it's really snotty.
Yeah,
and I love
totally.
it. So we're going to take a moment for anyone who's a pastor or on a church council to just think about times when these words have been said to your pastor. Pastor, we want you to do whatever we say.
And Jesus' response is, because this is what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't respond.
You ruined my moment of silence.
Jesus doesn't respond with, well, actually, I don't know if that would be a good idea or not. That kind of a thing. Or Jesus doesn't come back defensive. Jesus doesn't come back with a bunch of reasons why that Jesus shouldn't do this. Jesus doesn't come back with, are you kidding me? Like, seriously, people, right? Well, we actually don't know what the tone of voice is, but Jesus does respond in Jesus' typical fashion. If anyone asks you, what would Jesus do? Jesus is going to ask another question because that's what Jesus does. What would Jesus do in a situation? Jesus would just turn it around and say, what is it you want me to do for you? And it's a total setup because, and he's going to ask another question next after this, but yeah. So he responds with, he just says, well, what do you want me to do for you?
I might have said that last night at my council meeting.
Sometimes we remember what Jesus does. Sometimes
I might have said it. I don't think I did because I probably was patient.
So then these two, James and John, say, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory. Like, this is all about who's going to be the one up. Like, who's going to be the big kid at the end of the day? Who's going to be the big cheese? And they
mean when you're a king.
Yes.
You're pants and in charge of the whole world.
Yep. I'll be right back. I've got somebody knocking at my door.
Come and knock on my door. So Jesus' answer is, the cup that I drink will you drink, and with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and my left is not for me to say. And so Jesus is talking about bloody death on the cross and who will be on the left and who will be on the right, and says, fine, you're all going to become martyrs too. This is written well after, probably 150 years after, where they know that that's the case. And they also say that the Gentiles are going to mock them and that they should be much better than these other rulers who were way less helpful, and they should be less snotty, and they should be servants, and they should take care of each other, and they should go out there and do justice rather than demanding justice, feed people, blah, blah, blah. Right? That's all I'm saying.
Well, because Jesus is kind of like one of those people who turns things upside down. And
yeah. I like the idea of providing ransom for many. Historically, at the time, a lot of people would get kidnapped all the time. And
that never happens now.
Oh, well, way to make that dark. But, yeah. So a lot of people were getting ransomed all the time. And this idea that it's a trading of one life for another, I like that with my theory about suffering is stupid, and Jesus already did it, so let's stop it.
Quest done. Quest
check
complete.
It off, right?
Check it off. Move on to the next level.
Yeah, exactly. Baptism. Anyway, that's all I have to say on the subject. Do you have anything else you want to add, Amanda, while there's someone sitting on your couch who came over to visit?
No, it's okay. The dog just totally tackled her in this like jubilation of I haven't seen you in I don't know a couple of weeks, but forever and always. I think this is how God greets us.
Yeah, by tackling us.
Love of a pit bull.
Yeah, where have you been? Why don't you pet me?
I'm so excited that you're here and you exist that I think I need to lick your face for the next 5 minutes. I love
that's
you.
That's not how God greets us. That would make a very awkward, like, I just died. I got all the way to heaven. Stop licking me. Pastor Amanda. I mean, maybe with the same excitement, but maybe with like a hug.
Maybe a hug, not the licking of the face. You don't think
know,
God
maybe.
really licks everybody's face?
I feel like if God licks you, you just go with it, because who's got the chutzpah to say, God, stop licking me?
Well, according to our first lesson, we should say, okay, enough.
Enough!
Set
enough
boundaries. And this is the point where Bible study that doesn't suck kind of diverges to some really fascinating choices.
So. Well, thank you for coming. Sorry we were gone for so long. If you made it to the end, good job.
Well done, everybody.
We love you. Week. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.